Learning is one of our areas of cognitive psychology, which has to do with how we think. And what we mean when we talk about learning is a change in behavior due to experience. So there are three kinds of learning that we talk about in psychology: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And you can think about the word conditioning as simply being another word for learning. So we have classical learning, operant learning, and observational learning. So let's start with classical conditioning. What happens with classical conditioning is that you learn to associate two stimuli. Historically, Ivan Pavlov was the first one to identify classical conditioning, and he was interested in dog salivation or dog drooling. He had this apparatus set up where dogs were hooked in, and there was a test tube inserted into their jowls to collect the drool every time that they gave them food. But what he started noticing is that as his researchers were opening the door to bring the food, the dogs started salivating, which was strange because naturally there's no reason for you to salivate to a door opening. There's a very good reason to salivate to food coming, right? Because salivation is part of the process that helps break food down as it goes into our digestive system. But no reason for salivation to happen is as the door opened. So he started to wonder if the dogs were learning that the door opening meant they were about to get food, and if the body was actually responding before the stimulus, the food, was submitted. And that seems to be what had happened. They had been classically conditioned to drool to the opening of the door. So there's some very technical terms within classical conditioning that we're going to talk about. The first is the unconditioned stimulus, often referred to as the US, and this is the thing that naturally triggers the response that we're talking about. So here it would be food naturally triggering the response of drooling, and the natural response is called the unconditioned response, or the UR. It's the unlearned natural response to the US. So this is what happens before any researcher comes in and tries to teach a person or an animal anything, before any learning has occurred. The unconditioned stimulus leads to the unconditioned response. In our example with the dogs, we have the unconditioned stimulus of the food leading to the unconditioned response of salivation. But what Pavlov wanted to do to test his idea about the pairing of things like the door opening is he put in a bell. He wanted to know if he could teach a dog to salivate to a bell. And naturally, when you ring a bell, there's no response. Dogs shouldn't salivate. But there's the other two terms here, the conditioned stimulus, or the CS, which is the neutral stimulus that's paired with the unconditioned stimulus that eventually is going to cause the response. So something that starts neutrally, and that if it's paired with the unconditioned stimulus over and over and over again, eventually it's going to cause the response. And that response is now called the conditioned response. It's the learned response to the neutral stimuli. So these are the two names that we use after learning has taken place. So back to our dog example, we have the bell, which is the previously neutral stimuli, being paired with the food over and over again. What that means is they'd rang a bell and gave him food, rang a bell and gave him food, rang a bell and gave him food, over and over again. And of course the dog salivates because there's food involved. But what Pavlov wanted to know is, could he get to the point where the food wasn't necessary and simply the bell would cause the salivation? Once that was the case, when he could just ring the bell and the dog would salivate, the bell had become the conditioned stimulus because it now was causing the response. It was the learned way of causing the response, and there was salivation. So there's numerous phases to classical conditioning. The first phase is called acquisition, and that's what we just talked about. Acquisition is what happens when you pair the neutral stimuli with the unconditioned stimuli over and over and over again until the previously neutral stimuli becomes the conditioned stimuli, and it is now causing the response. So you can think of acquisition as a learning process. In classical conditioning, you can also unlearn, and unlearning comes from extinction. So one way that you could unlearn the bell causing salivation is to give the bell without the food numerous times. Eventually the dog would learn that there's no food associated with the bell, and they would actually stop drooling. So it's kind of like undoing the learning that you've done. Another thing that can happen, though, is something called spontaneous recovery. And spontaneous recovery occurs when you take the same thing that you had taught before during a previous acquisition phase and reteach it. So let's say that we had a dog who had learned how to salivate to the bell, and then we went through the extinction process so that they had unlearned salivation to the bell, and now we wanted to reteach them to salivate to the bell. Could we do that? And the answer is yes. We would go through the exact same process where we paired the bell with the food, the neutral stimuli with the unconditioned stimuli over and over and over again until it led to the response we were looking for. The interesting thing that happens, though, is that it takes less time to learn it the second time, and that's spontaneous recovery, so getting the learning back very quickly. Now, learning can happen in one of two potential variations. One is something called generalization could occur. So if you're talking about the acquisition phase and you've taught this dog to drool to this bell, would they also drool to other similar kinds of bells? Not the exact exact one they learned on, but things that make similar sounds. If this dog does drool to all of these different bells, then a process called generalization has happened. So they've learned to generalize the stimuli. The opposite can also happen, which is discrimination. So this dog has been trained to drool to this bell, and we give them some other bell sounds, and if they don't drool, discrimination has occurred, where they only will respond to the specific stimuli they learned on. So that's all we have to talk about for classical conditioning. And remember, classical conditioning is when you pair two stimuli over and over together and you learn an association between them. The second kind of learning is operant conditioning or operant learning. And here you learn to associate a behavior with a consequence. Now there are different types of consequences. There are reinforcers and there are punishers, which you probably have heard of before. So a reinforcement is a consequence that increases the frequency of a behavior. So any kind of consequence you can give a person to cause them to engage in more of that behavior is a reinforcement. So there are two kinds of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement, and here positive reinforcement means adding. Positive doesn't have the connotation of good, it has the connotation of adding something. So you're adding a desirable event to increase the frequency of behavior. So if you give a child a cookie to get them to clean their room, or after they've cleaned their room, that's a positive reinforcement. You've given them something that they want in an effort to get them to do the thing that you want them to do again, like clean their room again next time. Now there's also negative reinforcement, and negative reinforcement is what happens when you remove an undesirable event to increase the frequency of behavior. So negative again does not mean bad, it means removal. Positive means adding, negative means removal. I like this cartoon because it's talking about how babies know to cry to get what they want. And baby crying is one of the top 5 most grating, uncomfortable noises for human beings. And it's good because imagine what it would be like if a baby cried and it didn't bother you and you weren't motivated to go and make them stop. So when a baby cries because they need change, for example, you pick them up and you change them and they stop crying. That's a negative reinforcement because the crying has been taken away in an effort to get you to do the behavior of changing their diapers. This also works in your car probably, where when you start your car, if you don't buckle your seatbelt, the buzz noise will start coming on, or the dinging noise. And when does that stop? That stops when you click that seatbelt in. So the car industry is using negative reinforcement to try to increase your behavior of wearing the seatbelt by taking away something undesirable, taking away the obnoxious noise. But whether it's positive or negative reinforcement, you're trying to increase behavior frequency, as opposed to punishments, which are efforts to decrease the frequency of a behavior. So you might take away a toy to get a child to stop hitting, for example. A punishment is when you're trying to stop a behavior. And remember, those reinforcers are when you're trying to increase a behavior. Now, observational learning is a twist off of operant conditioning. It is based on conditions of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment also, but you can learn by watching others. You can see someone else get a consequence, either a good consequence or a bad consequence, and learn, which is a really great tool, because imagine what life would be like if you had to learn everything for yourself and couldn't learn from other people's mistakes. The most common kind of observational learning that we talk about is modeling. And modeling is kind of like the monkey see, monkey do idea, that we watch other people and how they behave and we mimic what they do. The classic experiment of modeling was the Bobo doll experiment in the early 1960s. And in this experiment, they showed children in one condition, their teacher hitting a Bobo doll, which is what we see in the top picture here. And a Bobo doll is one of those blow-ups that's got sand in the bottom, so when you hit it, it pounces back up. So half the children saw their teacher being mean and hitting the Bobo doll, and the other half of the children saw their teacher not hitting or being nice to the Bobo doll. And then basically they just put this doll out for kids to interact with during recess or during playtime, and the kids who had seen their teacher hit it more. Kids who had not seen their teacher hit it less. So the idea that you can learn by watching other people. Now the reason we can learn by watching other people is because we have these special neurons in our brain called mirror neurons. And we had learned before that when you do something, parts of your brain become active, right? If I am picking something up, my arm would activate the sensory and motor cortices in my brain. Mirror neurons allow for us to actually get that same activation by simply watching another person doing something. So our brain actually has activity when we watch another person engage in an activity or get a consequence. And that's how we learn via observational learning. So just to reiterate, the 3 kinds of learning are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning.